Welcome back. The Rajya Sabha has today cleared the Telecom bill that seeks to replace the Telegraph Act of 1885. This comes a day after the Lok Sabha had cleared the bill. The new law seeks to exclude OTT platforms from the scope of the bill. The bill also provides for allocation of spectrum in some cases rather than auction in every case, and also gives the government the power to take over telecom networks in case of public emergencies. For joining us now, for taking this discussion forward, I have with me Mr. Sumesh Srivastava, Senior Manager Public Policy for the Quantum Hub, as well as Mr. Sunil David, Co-Chairman of the Digital Communication Group IT Future Tech Panel. Mr. David, thank you so much for joining us. Mr. Srivastava, thank you so much for being a part of this. Mr. David, I'll come to you first. The intent of the government is very clear that as far as this new bill is concerned, it is set for overhauling the regulatory framework, which is outdated, which is Victorian. The thrust, however, I'll just first address the issue of OTT players. The government says that this is a vertical legislation which seeks to regulate only telecom companies. It is not a horizontal legislation that seeks to govern various sectors, and that's the stance. OTTs are out. However, the fine print, however, has given reason for doubt. There is some definitions as far as telecommunications is concerned, some definitions regarding messages. Is that a concern, or is it very clear on paper as well as from the spirit of the legislation that OTTs are out of the scope of Telecom Bill?
Thank you, Akshit, for inviting me to join this discussion. I spent almost 25 years of my 30-year career in the telecom industry, and I've seen waves of change over the last 3 decades. So it is really refreshing to see that we finally have a Telecom Bill 2023 that is going to replace the Indian Telegraph Act of 1885. Now, coming to some of the salient features of the bill, Ashmit, I think it's good that the OTT part is separated out, right? I think there's a very clear distinction that this is only going to focus on carriage. And I think that is very, very important. The very important aspect of this whole bill is the fact that it's going to simplify the whole licensing regime. I think the government would be authorized to offer to give operators license to offer services. So I think the authorization piece is one very important dimension. Second thing, I think there's a very clear distinction in terms of how spectrum is going to be assigned, right? So very clear guidelines in terms of how it's going to be traded, shared, and so on and so forth. The third thing which I want to highlight, Ashmit, is the fact that the lot of focus on security, right? I think that's a very, very important dimension. Given the threats that we're seeing from a cyber landscape today, I think the fact that there is a lot of focus now on trying to ensure that users are protected, especially government now perhaps in the position to take over telecom networks in the case of emergencies. So users being protected, I think that's also a very, very important dimension. But coming to the point regarding OTTs, I think...
Sure. I think we've lost Mr. David there. We'll try to connect back to him. I think some audio difficulties there. But let me take that same question across to Mr. Srivastava as well. OTTs in or out? Government says they're out. There are some questions that have been raised, however, on social media that seems to suggest that there are certain definitions that technically could also include OTT players. Your reading of the situation?
So, Ashmit, thanks for this opportunity. So I would say in terms of the difference between the 2022 draft and the 23 draft, the explicit mention of OTT services, broadcast, email, that has been dropped from the draft of the bill. So that is leading to one interpretation that OTTs are now out of the scope of the bill. But if we look at a broader interpretation, if we look at how telecommunication is defined, if we look at how messaging is defined, there is a possibility that this can be interpreted to bring OTTs into the framework as well. Sorry. So I would say that yes, for now, based on the fact that OTTs have been dropped from the 22 draft to this draft, this could be a likely interpretation, but it still leaves the door open for the government. If they want to bring OTTs into the framework of the bill in the future, they can very easily do it. The definitions can be stretched to do that. And just to give you an example in terms of how this can be made more clearer. So, for example, South Africa has a Electronic Communications Act, which also has a wide definition of telecommunication, but it specifically excludes content services from the definition. So I think if the government had done something like that, if there was an exclusion, it would have been more clearer. Right now, the possibility still remains.
Right, so there is some wiggle room there, which gives reason for perhaps a question mark. That's an interesting point that Mr. Srivastava is making. Mr. David is back with us. Mr. David, let me come back to you. One of the issues that you had raised was allocation of spectrum. Finally, there is now a statutory provision that provides that it needn't be auction in every case. There can also be allocation. And there are two key areas. Number one is for space communication. The other is for backhaul spectrum. How significant a development is this for the Indian telecom space?
I think this is a step in the right direction, Ashmit. The fact that now you can have spectrum given administratively to providers. I think it's very important from an Indian perspective to have a lot more foreign players competing in the Indian market, right? So with the spectrum now being given administratively, you're going to have perhaps Amazon, you're going to have Starlink provide satellite communication services. And this is only making sure that the consumers are going to get a better bang for the buck. You would have better quality of service being offered, right? And we are also following global norms, right? So if you just look at globally, when you look at satellite communication, spectrum has always been given administratively. I think I'm glad that we are now taking that path as far as India is concerned. And also very important, Ashmit, is that you just look at the equipment that are made, receivers, the fact that now you're going to have a common frequency bands that are going to be used, this interoperability will become far more easier now with the fact that you're going to have this whole harmonization of spectrum and spectrum being given administratively.
Interesting point that, Mr. David.
Overall good for the market, yes.
Interesting point that you're making there, Mr. David. And one aspect that has missed the headlines, of course, is that the government has also provided for allocation of backhaul spectrum connecting towers back to the core network. That has been a long-standing demand of the telecom companies as well. We're running out of time, Mr. Srivastava. I'll come to you for one closing comment on another pressing issue that, in fact, managed to make the headlines, which is the power that rests with the government to take over of telecom networks in case of public emergencies or natural disasters, or in cases of national security. The power rests with the government to even stop a certain class of messages from being pilfered or being shared on the telecom network. Just your reading of this power, which makes a new entry in this latest legislation, which wasn't there in the draft.
So, Ashmit, the powers themselves right now do not give me a major cause for concern till the time that we get details in the rules based on what will be the safeguards. The powers by themselves, the grounds given, they do seem to be fair. But how it will be implemented, we'll have to wait for the rules to come out. We'll have to wait for the specific safeguards to be defined. We'll have to see whether there will be administrative oversight or whether there will be judicial oversight mechanisms. So we'll have to wait and see for the rules to come out, for more operational details to come out, whether we can say this is something which is going to infringe fundamental rights, or whether this is something which is within the scope of what the government can do. So that analysis or that opinion will need to wait for more operational details to come out.
Right, Mr. Srivastava, right, Mr. David, thank you so much for being a part of this discussion. This is, of course, a lengthy bill. There are various parts of it that could merit an hour-long discussion, but that's all the time that we have. And it's a wrap on